Welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Rose-Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Jacy S. Bernath-Plaisted, an applied conservation scientist with the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, will be speaking about North America's grassland birds, past declines, current challenges, and future solutions. Before we get started, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they've worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. I'm delighted to let everyone know that we have a really awesome lineup of webinars happening this winter. Topics include bats in Cypress Hills, long-billed curlews in North America, as well as swift fox in Saskatchewan. And you can check out the PCAP website to register for upcoming webinars. Reminder to our listeners out there, you'll be muted for the duration of the presentation, but if you have any questions, just type it into the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard at any time, and questions will be answered towards the end of the webinar. I'd like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our presenting sponsors, Canadian Forage and Grasslands Association, North American Helium, Pembina, Saskatchewan Cattle Association, and SaskTel. Supporting sponsors are the Innovation Credit Union and Rancher Stewardship Alliance, Inc. In-kind support has been provided by Bird Conservancy of the Rockies. And I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter. Jacy grew up in rural Michigan, where he developed an early appreciation and respect for the natural world. Throughout his early career, Jacy worked on a wide array of ecological research projects, spending time in the sagebrush of Wyoming, in backcountry of Sierra Nevada, the endangered Florida scrub, and Long Point Bird Observatory on the shores of Lake Erie. In 2015, Jacy completed his master's degree at the University of Manitoba, where he studied the effects of energy development on grassland birds. After completing his doctoral degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2024, Jacy came to Bird Conservancy as an applied conservation scientist, a position that has given him the opportunity to blend his scientific background with his strong interest in the conservation of grasslands and the wildlife and ecosystem services they support. Jacy likes to spend his free time outdoors and enjoys hiking, camping, birding, running, and cycling. With that, I'll pass it over to Jacy.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction. And sounds like some cool webinar topics coming up. But yeah, I just want to say I really appreciate the invitation to come and speak to you folks about a topic that I'm really passionate about, and that is our grassland birds here in North America. And so before I jump into the talk, I just want to sort of acknowledge this talk is loosely structured on a review on grassland bird conservation that I led back in 2023. And so I want to acknowledge my many co-authors that worked with me on that. We had folks from the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And this QR code will take you to the paper if you're interested. And it is open access, so you don't have to sign up or deal with any paywalls or anything like that. Okay, so we'll just start with a little bit of level setting before we get into the management topics. So we'll kind of talk about defining what we actually mean by grassland birds and a little bit of their natural history. Probably this group knows more than most about grassland birds, but we'll go ahead and cover those basics anyway. So when we say grassland birds, we're actually kind of collectively referring to three taxonomic groups. We have our grassland songbirds, like this bobolink. We have certain upland nesting shorebirds, like the upland sandpiper. And then we've got kind of diurnal raptors and owls that are grassland associated. And, really, we mean grassland obligate species when we're referring to these. And obligate is kind of a jargony word, but really it just means these are species that, they evolved with these open grassland ecosystems. They're specialists. They really can't use anything else. So you're not going to find a bobolink nesting in the forest. And all these species have in common that they are primarily cryptic ground nesters. So they will nest on the ground, usually in sort of natural depressions, under grass overhangs, in forb clumps, and sometimes kind of hiding in plain sight, even in pretty bare ground. And anyone that's kind of spent time walking around in the prairie has probably had the experience of having a bird shoot up by their foot or seeing it run along the ground in front of them and then take off. And, that probably means you walked by a grassland bird nest. So I think maybe the most kind of important feature of the ecology of grassland birds to kind of point out is that, these species are not a monolith. So yes, they all inhabit these grassland biomes, but they actually have kind of unique preferences for vegetation conditions within those grasslands. And typically we partition them kind of along this spectrum of preferring, short, sparse vegetation, even bare ground, into more mixed clumpy grasses, and then all the way up into kind of tall grass and a little bit of mixed shrub habitat. And, the reason this is important is because it kind of makes these species a unique management challenge. If you're managing for those on one end of the spectrum, you're kind of by definition managing against those on the other end of the spectrum. And then, of course, our grazing activities, our cattle production, our management, things like fire regimes, they all interact really strongly and kind of determine these grassland vegetation conditions, these rangeland conditions that are important to these species. And so it makes it a really complex management challenge. And so we'll just take a little side note into evolutionary ecology here. So why do grassland birds have these different preferences? And we think that really that has to do with competition. So generally in the natural world, we think that species evolve to kind of avoid competing with each other for resources. It's better if your natural history kind of takes advantage of a part of the environment or a resource that a lot of other species aren't using. It makes it easy for you to be successful. And we think that grassland birds have kind of done this along this continuum of vegetation conditions. So we could imagine, maybe dick thistle came along and evolved to use this tall grass. And then grasshopper sparrow came along and it kind of evolved preferences to use more intermediate grass. And that way they're not directly competing for nest sites, for example. And so this idea is called niche segregation. And it's really just this idea that, species will kind of evolve to use parts of the physical environment and particular resources that are sort of unoccupied by other species. So that's a niche topic, so to speak, but just kind of an interesting side note to understand that evolutionary history. Okay, so let's kind of look at the distribution of grassland birds. And I think, it's just important to recognize that these species are, many of them are short distance migrants. So they don't spend all their lives on the Great Plains where many of us see them. And so when we're thinking about their conservation, we're thinking about what we call the full annual cycle, sort of all the times and places that they go. And so on the breeding season, if we look here, this plot is just showing in panel A kind of the distribution, the density of species that are using different areas. And so, this kind of just highlights there's about 30 grassland obligates in North America, depending on how you define them. And we can see that, the Northern Great Plains is a really important hotspot in the breeding season. So many of these species are using that area. So that really suggests that, the management of these grasslands is really important to them. And then if we look over at panel B and the non-breeding distribution, we can see that these species are wintering in different places. Some of them go to the southeastern United States. Some of them even go to South America. But most of them are going to this region we call the Chihuahuan Desert Grasslands. And that's northern Mexico, the southwestern United States. And I just want to highlight this because, we're going to talk more about what is happening on the breeding grounds in the Great Plains today. But even if we do an amazing job kind of managing our grasslands and restoring them, if we don't pay attention to what happens on the wintering grounds, we're going to lose these species that way as well. So it's always just kind of important to be cognizant of that. Okay, so, the reason we're talking about grassland birds today is because they're not doing very well. They have been one of the most deeply and persistently declining groups. And we've known this kind of since we've analyzed some of our first breeding bird survey data sets, which kind of go back to the 70s. And that's kind of our longest running data set here in North America to sort of track what's happening with trends. And we know that about 75% of our species have negative annual trends, our grassland birds. And more recently, another analysis was done that sort of quantified the magnitude of these declines in a different way. And they estimate that collectively we've lost about 53% of our grassland bird populations since 1970. And they equate that to, roughly 720 million individual birds. So it's kind of a shocking number to conceptualize. And here they're just showing, they're taking eastern meadowlark as an example. This is kind of an iconic grassland bird that's had really steep declines. And they're saying, we only have about 1 out of 4 eastern meadowlarks that we would have had in 1970. So just kind of making it more tangible in that way. Okay, so we've kind of defined grassland birds, talked about their ecology a little bit, and we've established that they are steeply declining. So, why should you care about that? Why do grassland birds matter? And, I think maybe this group doesn't need to be convinced of that, but I think it's always worth sort of addressing this. And there's a couple of reasons that I usually will give people. So I think the first is that, we really are in a global biodiversity crisis right now. And in that sense, every species matters as we continue to lose species. And grassland birds, they evolved in these grassland ecosystems and they play a role in them. So they're seed dispersers. They control insect populations, including species that we consider to be pests. And they also, their eggs, their nests actually serve as food for other species like snakes, like small mammals. So they are an integral part of these systems. And I think it's true that, if grasshopper sparrow went extinct tomorrow, your life probably wouldn't change. But I like to think of biodiversity as kind of like this many-legged table. And you can go on cutting legs off for a while and your table will still stand. But eventually, if you keep going, it is going to collapse. And I think that biodiversity is like that as well. If this continues, it will affect us. I think another thing about grassland birds is that they really are these specialists that are really tied to our grassland ecosystems. And, our grasslands provide a lot of important ecosystem services. They sequester carbon, they prevent erosion, they provide pollination services, and they support our food production. And so I think grassland birds are kind of a canary in the coal mine for what happens in grasslands. If we continue to see our grassland birds decline, that really tells us that something is not going right in our grassland ecosystems and that we should take notice of that. And finally, I think that they do have inherent and cultural value. Many of them are very beautiful, very interesting. They have these songs that we associate with these Western landscapes. And I think, on some level, we have this intuitive sense, it would be sort of a sad day if you bring your grandkids out to a ranch that's been in the family for a century and they can't hear a Western meadowlark sing anymore. I think that, on some level, most of us just don't really want to see that happen. Okay, so now we're going to get into more of the kind of management content, talk about some of the drivers of grassland losses. And so the remainder of the talk is going to be broken up into these 3 sections. So we'll talk about historical grassland losses, which is really what has kind of brought us to the grassland bird crisis that we're in today. And a lot of these losses happened during the settlement era, European settlement of North America, but we're still kind of experiencing the ramifications of that. We'll talk about contemporary and ongoing threats. Some of them are similar to those threats that started all the way back during settlement, and some of them are new. And then we'll talk about, different kinds of management solutions, whether it's policy and legislation or just management adjustments that we can try to make. And, before I sort of go into these historical grassland losses, I just want to acknowledge we're going to talk a lot about agricultural conversion because that really has been the primary driver of our grassland habitat loss. But, I'm not here to blame farmers or wag my finger. That's not what this is about. Our grasslands have produced some of the most arable, productive soils in the world, and we have really fed ourselves with them for the last 2 centuries. And I think, the grassland bird crisis, the loss of our grasslands, is really about just recognizing that the land use decisions that we make as a society have consequences. And if we want to see different outcomes, if we want to see different biodiversity outcomes, we've got to put different systems in place that can support landowners in helping deliver those ecosystem services that we want. And so I think that's really what this discussion is about. And we'll talk about that a little more. Okay. So let's look at the historical extents of our grassland biomes here in North America. I'm not showing all of them. We don't have the California annual grasslands or the southeastern coastal grasslands here, but looking at our Great Plains biomes, we have tallgrass prairie in the blue. And this biome has by far experienced the most catastrophic losses. So depending on whose estimate you go with, there's about 3% of this habitat remaining. And that's really because, these more eastern grasslands occur in areas where precipitation was more favorable for agriculture. And so they really experienced a lot more conversion. Then we have our mixed grass prairie and our short grass prairie. And these two systems have done a lot better, about 48% remaining of these habitats. And that's again really because these systems are drier and they require a lot more input for cereal crops. So rangeland and cattle production has really been more of a dominant land use that's kept these grasslands intact. And then, of course, this is that Chihuahuan desert grasslands that I highlighted earlier. Also has experienced very heavy losses, about 15% remaining of this habitat. And a particular kind of agriculture called center pivot agriculture has been sort of the major driver of habitat loss in this region. Okay, so what do the Great Plains look like today in terms of land cover? And we'll just kind of look at the breakdown here. And so we can see we've got about 40 some percent in native cover, and that's primarily grassland. Some of it is shrub steppe. Some of it is native grasslands that are probably having woody encroachment, and we'll talk about that. But more or less, we've got about 40% intact. And then we can see really the only other big piece of this pie is that cropland at 41%. So that really has been the major driver of land use change. And most of that did happen during settlement, as I mentioned. And during that time, governments of both the United States and Canada were really subsidizing the settlement of the West and encouraging agricultural use, encouraging planting of trees and shelter belts. And so this really was, something that these governments really endorsed and facilitated. And at that time, of course, we had very little understanding of the consequences of that land use change, and that was not the priority, of course. And so, in addition to this kind of outright habitat loss, another consequence of these grassland losses has been kind of a change in the spatial configuration of our remaining grasslands and what we call fragmentation. So a lot of our grasslands are kind of broken up into these smaller patches and separated by other land use types. And that's a problem for grassland birds for two reasons. And this figure is just showing some of that fragmentation. So it's a little bit hard to look at, but those warmer yellow and orange colors are showing grassland patches that are basically less than a kilometer from what we call a fragmenting cover class. So, a crop edge or a road or a homestead. And then those few areas that have the darker blues and purples are kind of our larger, more connected patches that are further from these other habitats, basically. But so fragmentation is bad for grassland birds. One, because a lot of them are what we call area sensitive. So again, they evolved to use these large open landscapes, and some of them simply won't use small habitat patches, even if they appear to be otherwise suitable. They just don't recognize them as viable habitat. So that results in sort of what we would call functional habitat loss. Technically the habitat's still there, but species really can't meaningfully use it. And then another related issue is edge effects. And so this really has to do with this idea that these different kinds of habitat edges that break up grasslands like cropland, like roads, those introduce kind of different generalist species and nest predators that wouldn't normally be in open grasslands. And so, you could think if you're a grassland bird kind of nesting in a grassland and you're next to a homestead or a shelter belt, maybe you've got a raccoon that's kind of going out on a foray and predating your nest and then going back to the shelter belt that it lives in. So that's going to depress your reproductive success. And that wouldn't be happening if you were kind of out in a large grassland that wasn't adjacent to these other land use types. Okay, so, we had this direct habitat loss. We had some of this functional habitat loss. The other big thing that happened during settlement really was the disruption of kind of our historical disturbance regimes that really maintained these grasslands. So, of course, grazing and specifically the elimination of the bison is the most famous example of that. And, bison helped kind of maintain these open grasslands. And they also created some of those diverse vegetation conditions that we saw that different grassland bird species need. They would go through and they would graze intensely in one area and then go off to another area. And you would have kind of grassland in these different stages of succession. And that would, of course, interact with fire as well. And so that often is kind of poetically referred to as this shifting mosaic of grassland conditions. But bison were not the only grazers. So another really important keystone species in grasslands are prairie dogs. And they, would create really short vegetation structure that some species like mountain plover and thick-billed longspur require. And then they're also a really important food source for a lot of our grassland raptors. And so, this is a figure from a recent review, kind of looking at support in literature for studies showing, how important prairie dogs are to these different grassland raptors. And that pale blue color is indicating studies that found that they were important. And so you can see kind of across the board, a lot of our grassland raptor species really are eating these guys. And so they're important in that sense as well. And, of course, prairie dogs are not popular with ranchers and producers, and we do a lot of management and poisoning of them, but they are a keystone species that really has a disproportionate effect on grassland biodiversity. And, unlike the bison, we still do have, native prairie dogs living out here, but it's estimated that about 5% of what we historically had is still on the landscape, so much less. And then, of course, that other component that I mentioned, fire, was also a really important disturbance in the Great Plains. And, those fires historically happen from lightning strikes, and then also actually from fires that indigenous people set. So there's increasing evidence that indigenous peoples actually were essentially, our first grassland managers here in North America, and they would set fires to kind of maintain open hunting grounds and grow plants that they wanted. And so they were essentially practicing prescribed burns. But European settlers were pretty effective at suppressing fires across the board. And if we look here, this is actually a figure from a paleoecology study looking at the charcoal record in the Northern Great Plains. And what we can see basically is that charcoal record really drops off around the turn of the century there. And so we really have suppressed fires. And of course, today, in many regions, we do a lot of prescribed burning and try to return those natural disturbance regimes, but it's been very difficult really to achieve what would have been the fire return intervals that we once had. So that really is kind of the history of our grassland habitat losses and degradation that really probably precipitated a lot of those initial steep declines of grassland birds that we've seen. So now we're going to talk about sort of some of the ongoing and contemporary threats that these species are still facing. And some of them are similar and some of them are new. And this section isn't the most cheerful. So we'll just try to get through it and kind of lay out what those threats are. And then hopefully, have a little bit more uplifting stuff and talking about maybe some of the ways that we could address those threats. So we've talked about agriculture as this major driver of land use change historically, and it still is today. So it still is the primary source of our grassland habitat loss, not at the scales that it once was, but still substantial. So this is a figure from World Wildlife Fund's plow prints that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And it's basically showing, intact grasslands that have never been plowed in that green. And then the orange and yellow are grasslands that have been plowed historically or recently. And Plowprint estimates that the sort of 10-year annual grassland loss is about 2.6 million acres or 10,000 kilometers. So still a very substantial source of grassland habitat loss today. The other thing that's happened with agriculture is that, aside from the fact that we're still converting grasslands, we've also kind of changed the way that we do agriculture. And so initially, after those early losses, many grassland birds were able to kind of shift to using these surrogate agricultural grasslands like pastures and hayfields. But in modern times, we've had increasing agricultural intensification. And this term really refers to this idea that we have really mechanized, input heavy, monocrop type agriculture that we're doing a lot more of. This is a figure from a review kind of correlating grassland bird declines with agricultural intensification. And they're showing kind of all these direct and indirect pathways that grassland birds could be affected by these activities. But I want to kind of talk about two major aspects of this in particular. And one is mechanized mowing and haying activities. These can cause really massive nest destruction and mortality for grassland birds. And you could imagine, if you're a meadowlark nesting in a brome field and, a tractor goes over your nest, that's not going to be very good for your reproductive success. And oftentimes these haying activities are going to be pretty well synchronized with grassland birding, grassland bird breeding seasons. So, anywhere May through July is potentially going to be pretty destructive for these species. And there was a study in Canada that was estimating fledgling mortality from mowing activities. And they show, kind of depending on the range of grassland bird species that they looked at, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of fledglings that get killed by these activities in Canada alone. So it's a really large source of grassland bird mortality. And the second big one is neonicotinoid compounds, everybody's favorite chemical. So neonics, of course, are now the most widely used insecticide globally. They're extremely potent, and they've gotten a lot of negative press about their effects on bees and pollinators, which they've been very detrimental for. And in fact, they've been banned in Europe for that reason. But we also increasingly are seeing that they are likely quite negative for birds as well. So of course, they kill some of the insect food sources that birds need, but they can also have direct effects. So there's laboratory studies that have shown that consumption of a few of these seeds can be lethal for small birds. And we also know that there are sublethal effects. So we've seen that they can depress reproductive success, and they can actually impair migratory ability as well. And there's been some more recent studies that have kind of shown, again, correlations with the rise of these neonics and grassland bird declines. And the thing about neonics is not just that they're potent. There's kind of two things here. One is that they are everywhere. So we treat about 35 to 45% of our soybean seed and about 80 to 100% of our corn seed right off the bat with neonics in North America. And this is a figure from a review showing in the United States Great Plains neonic use by county. And so we can see that those golden colors there, some of those brighter counties scattered throughout the Great Plains, are really high use areas. The other thing that's kind of unique about neonics is how they work. So they're this kind of systematic water soluble compound. And rather than necessarily having to apply them to the crops like a conventional pesticide would, we treat our seeds with them, and then they're actually kind of infused in the tissue of the plant as it grows. So this makes them really effective at sort of traveling through the whole food chain, and they can travel in ground and surface water quite a distance, and they have a very long half-life in the environment. So once they get out there, they don't really go anywhere. And there was a study in Texas that looked at this recently, where they were kind of looking at bird exposure to neonics, looking at physiological evidence of it across different habitats and different foraging guilds. And what they found was that, unlike conventional pesticides, where it's really the species that use agricultural habitats that get exposed, with neonics, this stuff is kind of just everywhere in the environment, and a lot of species are getting exposed to it regardless of where they're actually spending their time. And so that's quite alarming. Okay. So we're going to pivot away from agriculture now and talk about another major source of grassland habitat loss and degradation today. This is probably the number 3 threat to grasslands, and it's woody encroachment. And grasslands have always kind of had a natural woody component to them at low densities. So a lot of these shrubs and tree species are native to the Great Plains. But with the lack of disturbance, and in some cases, too much disturbance, they've started to really be able to take over and grow at much higher densities than they historically did. And that's caused a state shift where you sort of get these grassland herbaceous environments turning more into like these shrublands or savannas. And so this is a figure showing the United States and increase in tree cover. So you can see really big issue in the Southern Great Plains, but also it's happening in different areas of the whole Great Plains region. And the mechanisms for this are pretty complicated. So as I mentioned, in some cases it's, well, we're not, having fire at the same return intervals that we used to that would sort of keep these woody species at bay. In other cases, it's like actually we're grazing too heavily and that's creating like an erosion feedback cycle where these shrubs are able to sort of maintain their foothold, but more herbaceous species are not. And then we also know that woody plants benefit from CO2 fertilization. So those higher CO2 levels allow these species to put on biomass more easily. So it's a really complicated topic, but it's a really important one. And of course, woody encroachment is not very good for rangeland health. That is going to reduce our herbaceous forage production, for example. So it's not good for ranching. And it's also not good for grassland birds, again, because they didn't evolve in that kind of environment. They require these open grasslands, and many of them, once you start to get a high density of woody plants, they'll just stop using that habitat. So this is a study that recently was looking at this, where they're kind of looking at changes in grassland bird density with different levels of woody plant cover. And they looked at this for a bunch of different sort of groups and combinations. But if we just focus on this upper left-hand figure, which is kind of the summary for the response of grassland obligate species, we can see that we've got bird density on the y-axis, we've got woody cover on the x-axis, and we've got this really obvious negative correlation. So not good for grassland birds. Okay, and probably like again, maybe the number two, number three driver of land use change in grasslands is actually energy development. And this can be, conventional oil, natural gas extraction, can be wind turbines, and it can be solar, which I think is going to be an increasingly important driver of land use in the decades to come. And it's estimated that about 20% of Western North America is actually impacted by energy leases. And that may seem hard to believe until you look at a figure like this. So again, this is the US portion of the Great Plains, and we can see those oil and gas well leases in red and the wind turbines in blue, and solar is not even shown on this figure. And, the actual direct habitat loss of any of these one leases is pretty small. But each one of them is often associated with kilometers of access roads and fences and power lines, and that contributes to this grassland fragmentation. It introduces those edge effects, and it really affects a much larger area than what is immediately lost from the lease site. And in fact, we've seen that there are quite a few negative impacts on grassland birds from energy development activities. So this is a summary table from our review. And, studies on this have been mixed. We found that species responses to energy development seems to be pretty idiosyncratic. Some will avoid it, some won't. But overall, a lot of negative effects across many taxa have been documented. So if we just look at some of these effects that are listed, there's outright habitat destruction and nest destruction that happens during construction. There's collision and contamination. There's that avian avoidance or functional habitat loss. There are reproductive effects. And there's also, stress physiology type things that happen with anthropogenic noise. And there's also introduction of non-native vegetation. So there's a number of ways in which this can really degrade these grasslands for grassland bird species. Okay, so we weren't going to get away without talking about climate change also. Grasslands generally are these low elevation occurring open systems. A lot of them are in the center of the continent, and they tend to be in regions that are considered to have what we call a high velocity of climate change. And that really just means that those changes are going to happen more quickly there than in some other places where you might have elevational buffering, where you might get microclimate benefits from having a forest canopy, things like that. And so we know that grassland birds are probably going to have a pretty high exposure to this. So this is a figure from our review that's kind of showing projected changes in maximum temperatures between our current climate normals and our future climate normals under kind of a moderate emission scenario. So we can see that a lot of that deep purple, where you're going to have the greatest increases, is in the middle of the continent where a lot of our grasslands are. And then this is overlaid with the breeding range of Henslow sparrow, just kind of showing a lot of these grassland birds have small breeding ranges, and their entire range is probably going to experience a lot of this increase in temperature. And we also have increasing evidence that, yes, grassland birds probably are pretty sensitive to some of these climate changes. So this is a figure from a review that we did, basically looking at all published studies that kind of look at the effects of different climate variables on different demographic variables for grassland birds. So looking at nesting success and adult and juvenile survival. And it's a lot to look at here. But again, let's just kind of focus on this summary across all responses. And what we really see is that there's two things that stand out as being pretty consistently negative for these species. One is higher temperatures, and then most of all is drought. And of course, drought is a natural part of the ecology of the Great Plains, but we've seen it appear to be getting more frequent and more severe, more mega droughts, and this is probably going to be quite negative. And there's a lot of reasons that, higher temperatures and drought can affect reproductive success for grassland birds. They're small endotherms, so temperatures getting into the high 30s, usually you start to have, adult mortality, nestling mortality, egg inviability, and you also get what we call sort of behavioral trade-offs. So if you are an adult nesting bird and you have to spend all your time kind of shading the nest and fanning it because it's too hot, well, that's time that you can't spend foraging and provisioning your young. So there's things like that that can happen. And then drought, of course, can fundamentally affect the food chain, the primary productivity in grasslands. It can affect the habitat structure with drying and dying vegetation. So overall, probably not going to be very positive for grassland birds. And then finally, on top of all those big picture things, I think we still face the basic challenges of kind of managing our rangelands for multiple objectives. And we have, what kind of fire and grazing should we do? How can we balance production and grassland bird habitat needs? I think one thing that gets talked about a lot is that we've seen a lot of kind of rangeland simplification or homogenization. So a lot of managing to the middle using a moderate stocking rate. That might be sort of good for preventing overgrazing, but it's not very good for creating that heterogeneity that we need for different grassland species. And then we also have, a lot of problems with invasive species that have spread throughout the Great Plains. So it's really complicated, and there's a lot of challenges that can affect grassland birds. All right, deep breath. So that was kind of a summary of these many challenges that these species are facing. And now we will, talk about hopefully what are some potential solutions or ways that we could mitigate these different challenges. And I'm going to kind of loosely break this up into what I consider to be more like big picture policy, legislative, landscape planning type solutions. And then we'll also talk a little bit more about site level management, maybe farm level, ranch level type decisions. Okay, so, I think if we're really serious about wanting to reverse grassland bird declines, we've got to find a way to scale grassland conservation continentally across countries. We've got to just stop these habitat losses and try to turn them around if we really want to stop losing these species. And I think that really requires an understanding of the economics that are involved in asking people to provide these ecosystem services. If you're a landowner that's depending on this property for your livelihood and you need to crop it, you have to sell it to a developer, for energy development, for lease, we've got to find ways to support people economically in being able to maintain their grass and the ecosystem services that it provides for grassland birds and to society. And I think the Conservation Reserve Program in the United States, or CRP, has actually demonstrated that a mechanism like that can work quite well. And this is a program, of course, that basically pays people to, it gives you rental payments to put your marginal croplands back into permanent cover and maintain them as, herbaceous grassland, essentially. And we've really seen that has been effective for grassland birds. So there's a number of studies that have shown, a wide range of species responding positively to this. I'm just going to show you one figure that I think summarizes it kind of nicely, or not summarizes, but demonstrates it, I guess. And so this is a figure looking at population trends for Henslow sparrow on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis, it's percent CRP by county. So each of those open circles there is a county with a different percentage of CRP. And what we can see is that we've got this pretty clear positive relationship where, those counties that have a really high percentage of CRP cover, we're actually moving from negative population trends to positive population trends. And so I think this really shows us what shouldn't be surprising. And that's that, grass on the ground is better than no grass on the ground. That really is the fundamental driver of these grassland bird declines. And yeah, I think that's really underscored by the fact that, CRP is not a perfect program. Historically, most of these properties were actually seeded with cool season non-native grasses and forbs. Today, it's a mix. Some of them are now native. And they're also sort of limited. A lot of them, you can't have much grazing. And so that limits their suitability for species that require that shorter structure. So, it's really a very blunt instrument, and yet it's still been very effective for a lot of grassland bird species. And I think this just really demonstrates how, a program like this really can scale grassland conservation if we invest in it. Canada actually had a similar program called Canada's Permanent Cover Program, and that was only around for a decade or two in the 80s and 90s. But there was a couple of studies that showed that that also seemed to be pretty effective for grassland birds. Okay, so I think another thing that could happen at sort of a big picture or a legislative level is that we can do a better job of regulating energy leases. And I don't mean we're going to have a moratorium on energy development in the Great Plains. We still need energy, and we're still going to be extracting it. But I think there's two things that we can do. And one is just being really intentional in our landscape planning about where developments go. So I think really trying to prioritize, stacking our land uses, putting wind turbines in cropland, putting solar development on rooftops, trying to put these leases in already disturbed areas rather than sort of tearing up virgin grassland and high quality habitat areas. There was a recent study that did an analysis where they kind of looked at environmental suitability for wind turbines for energy production. And then they looked at important habitat areas for lesser prairie chicken in the Southwest. And then they kind of did like a reverse Venn diagram. So, where do those conditions not overlap? And I think that is the kind of landscape planning that we should really be trying to do to minimize the effects of energy development on wildlife habitat. I think the second thing that we could do is just provide better regulation and guidance about reclamation and restoration of lease sites. So, you saw on that map showing all those oil wells in the Great Plains. Well, not all those are active. There's a lot of abandoned and no longer in production lease sites in the Great Plains that stay on the landscape for longer than they should. And we should really do a better job of requiring that companies restore these sites on a reasonable timeline to minimize the amount of disturbance that's on the landscape at once, and making sure that they restore these sites properly and that they use native seed when they're reseeding. During my master's work looking at oil and gas development in Alberta, I can't tell you how many times I could tell where a pipeline was buried because there would just be a line of crested wheatgrass going through the prairie for kilometers. And I think, that's kind of an unforced error. We can do a lot better than that. Okay, and I think another thing that we can really do at the governmental level is we need to regulate neonicotinoids. We know that they're extremely harmful. We've seen it for pollinators. We're seeing it increasingly for birds. It's in many cases overkill. Not every crop, not every location, not every year actually has a serious pest problem. But when we're kind of just using treated seeds as the baseline, we're basically just kind of, using these high chemical inputs no matter what. And I think what's ironic or frustrating about this is that the yield gains for neonics are the evidence for it is pretty marginal actually. So there's different studies that have found different things with different crops, but there really isn't a lot of like really clear evidence that these are actually greatly boosting our crop yields on a regular basis. So this is a figure looking at soybean yields in the United States under different treatments. So they looked at control, they looked at fungicide and neonics and just neonics. And that's not very compelling given the environmental costs, the costs of these chemical inputs monetarily. I think in many cases, conventional pesticides or even integrated pest management would be perfectly adequate rather than, having these really harmful environmental externalities. So I think that's a major area where we could look to governments to do a better job regulating. Okay, and I think the last big picture thing that we could think about is our landscape planning when it comes to climate change and trying to incorporate climate adaptation into our practices. And I think for grassland birds, there's two strategies in particular that are kind of important here. So the first is kind of thinking about climate context when we're thinking about where we really want to make our investments in grassland reserves and easements and things like that. And there's already a lot of landscape context to think about. And of course, we have to look at habitat value and other things like that. But I think also trying to look at predictions, trying to identify areas that might be a little more buffered from climate change, places that have maybe more topographic diversity and a little bit more resilience. That could maybe give grassland birds more footholds where they could hang on and maybe have more time to adapt or transition to other places. And then I think related to that is, really trying to address this grassland fragmentation issue could help increase our climate resilience. And for grassland birds, we know that they're semi-nomadic already. They evolved with a lot of disturbance. They move around on the landscape. And we've seen that they actually move around in response to climate disturbances. So there's been work, for example, on dick sissels showing that, during extreme drought in the core of their range, they all move out to the edge of the range and kind of avoid it for that breeding season. And so I think the more that we can make sure that our grasslands are connected and have stepping stones and that they kind of span the ranges of these species, the more we can kind of facilitate those natural movements that may help grassland bird populations be less affected by increasing climate extremes. Okay, so those were kind of the big picture things. So now let's talk a little bit more about maybe some farm level, ranch level management adjustments that we could do. So thinking about cropland itself, right? We're not just suddenly going to turn all of our cropland into grasslands overnight. There's a ton of crop out there, and obviously we still need food production. So the question is there any way that we can try to reduce this land use intensity while still, understanding that we're going to have crop use? And I think one kind of really cool win-win solution that has emerged to help address that is this idea of prairie strips, where basically you're just leaving a little buffer at the margins of your fields and seeding that with native grasslands. And so you just have this kind of prairie strip between your crops. And that has benefited producers in that it can control erosion, can increase water quality, can increase pollination services, and it also provides a little bit of habitat for grassland birds. Now, we've talked about how, not all species can use small patches, how there can be edge effects, and that's true. But I think this also just gets back to this idea of, some habitat is better than no habitat. And there are some species that have been able to use these strips. So this is a study that basically looked at grassland bird abundance between these conventional crops in the red bars and then crops with prairie strips in the blue. And we can really see that for some species, like dick sissel, even eastern meadowlark showing a little bit of a positive effect here. So grassland birds are able to use these habitats a little bit. And I think that this is a great example of the kinds of ways that we can look to sort of mitigate that land use intensity. I think another really big one is haying dates. So, if you've got brome fields on your property that you're haying during the breeding season, probably one of the most direct ways you could have a positive impact on grassland birds is making sure that you're pushing that hay date into August and avoiding that huge mortality for nests and for fledglings. And, obviously different operations have different flexibility. Some folks are trying to get two harvests in a season. It's going to be hard to avoid that overlap. But if this is something that you can do, this probably is like one of the most direct ways that you could have a positive impact. And it's pretty simple. Okay, and then finally, we come to range management. And I think ecologists and conservationists have really invested a huge amount of time and effort and resources in studying this, for the past 30 years and, kind of trying to find a silver bullet for, grazing and grassland birds. And, spoiler alert, we haven't found one. This is really complicated. Every region is different. Every ranch is different. Every climate year is different. and grassland bird species have different preferences. So, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I have the perfect prescription for how you should manage your ranch for grassland birds. But I am just going to cover a couple basic things that I think can kind of frame how you might want to think about this if you wanted to make some intentional management changes to benefit grassland birds on your ranch. So I think the first thing that you could think about is, having a plan and taking an inventory. And by that, I mean, it's difficult to make an intentional management adjustment if you don't have a really clear sense of what you're doing and what you have on your property. So I think, having a forage inventory, making a grazing plan, kind of understanding what your stocking rate is relative to your forage capacity, and also understanding what biodiversity you have on your ranch. So if you can get a resource professional out there to survey the grassland birds for you, that can give you a sense of what species you might want to target with management and maybe learn a little bit about what the priority species in your area are. So I think just kind of getting this boilerplate information can be really helpful place to start and thinking about what sort of management you might want to do. And then I think related to that is like identifying a specific management goal. I think we talk generally about management for grassland birds, but in some ways there is no general case. I think it's always going to be sort of specific to the resource concerns on your ranch and the species that you want to benefit. And I think, if there is one general principle, I think we generally think that, trying to find ways to introduce more heterogeneity onto your ranch is probably going to be beneficial. But, again, how you're going to do that and what species you're going to target could be very different. And so as far as identifying a management goal, it may not even actually be grazing that's your priority. So, if you have woody encroachment on your property, actually addressing that might be really beneficial for grassland birds, reducing that functional habitat loss. And it might be a good investment for your operation as well, kind of increasing that herbaceous forage. And I think similarly, if you've got cheatgrass that's coming in on your ranch, addressing that might be a great place to start. That's going to improve overall rangeland health, and that's probably going to benefit grassland birds as well. So identifying that goal, I think, is really the first step before you think about this next part, which, of course, is where the rubber hits the road in a lot of ways. And that's, choosing a grazing system and a stocking rate, right? And, obviously, you've got to pick something that works for your operation and then something that's hopefully going to help you meet the goal that you've identified for the species or community that you want to benefit. And I think a few general comments on this, maybe the first thing I would say is that I don't think, as I alluded to, I don't think that there really is any universal prescription for one grazing system always being better than another for grouse and birds. So, I think we talk a lot about, moving people from season-long continuous to rotational grazing. And there are cases where there can be benefits to that, but there really isn't any strong evidence that, fixed rotational grazing is better for grouse and birds than season-long continuous grazing. It's always going to depend on the conditions at the ranch and the birds that you're trying to benefit. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that studies have pretty consistently showed that your stocking rate is probably going to have more of an impact on that vegetation structure that's important to grouse and birds than your grazing system per se is. And so I think, again, you really want to identify the community or the species that you want to benefit. So, if you're in, prairie chicken country, if you're trying to benefit Baird sparrow, then maybe you want to think about, reducing your stocking rate, trying to incorporate rest and deferment into your grazing system. But if you're, in the shortgrass prairie and you're managing for thick-billed longspur and mountain plover, it actually might be really appropriate for you to use season-long continuous grazing with a high stocking rate, even to the point where you're seeing a little bit of bare ground patches. That's actually what those species prefer. So it so much is going to depend on things like that. And this is a figure just kind of illustrating this from a study that was looking at grazing systems and adaptive grazing in shortgrass prairie. And they're kind of highlighting here that, if your goal is to sort of create general heterogeneity and maybe support multiple species, you could look at something like adaptive multi-paddock grazing, where, maybe you have short duration, high intensity grazing, but then you're also resting one paddock a year. So you've got paddocks that are sort of in different successional stages, and you could maybe support species with a couple different preferences. Or if you actually just want to focus on a particular priority species, that's where a season-long continuous can be, totally appropriate. I think the other thing to think about with heterogeneity is that, if you have a lot of different vegetation communities and soil types and topography and wetlands, you may be able to have heterogeneous conditions even using season-long continuous grazing, especially if you are, maybe using a little bit of virtual fencing to keep them out of sensitive areas or redistribute that grazing pressure. If you're mixing in patch burn grazing to create a little more heterogeneity. So I think there's a lot of ways to approach this, and it really does come down to kind of thinking about, what your ranch has the flexibility to do and what species you actually hope to benefit from the activities that you're undertaking. So this is a huge topic, and that was some pretty vague advice, maybe, but yeah, I think there really is no sort of universal advice that I would feel comfortable giving on grazing and grass and bird management in that sense. Okay, so let's kind of try to pull this together and summarize what we talked about. So yes, grassland birds face a lot of threats. A lot of them interact with other things that are happening in our society and our economy, our land use, our production, our energy development, and then some big picture things like climate change that, an individual manager, an individual landowner really doesn't have any control over. So there's a lot of threats. It's a complicated problem. But if there can be a silver lining to that, I think it's that because these threats are so multifaceted and multi-scaled, I think that means that there's a lot of opportunity for stakeholders of all different kinds to be involved and find ways to participate in grouse and bird conservation if that's something that they want to do and are able to do. And I think I'll just close by saying, if there's any producers or landowners out there listening, 87% of our remaining grasslands in the Great Plains are privately managed. And so, you might think, well, this grouse and bird problem is so big, what happens on my little property, I can't make a difference. But what happens on your land matters. And I think at the end of the day, the best thing you can do for grouse and birds is find a way to keep your grass on the ground. So maybe that's just keeping your ranch in production. And that alone is going to provide a lot more habitat than if it has to get converted to some other use. And with that, I think be happy to take any questions.
First of all, thanks so much for the really detailed and interesting presentation. You had a really great way of wording some things, and I made some notes here in the background.
Thank you.
As you can imagine, we got lots of questions already, and I know we're a little tight on time. Are you okay to stay on like 5 minutes after 1?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I'll try to hit the kind of the most popular ones. You talked about prairie dogs. Does that also apply to ground squirrels? For example, are the Richardson's ground squirrels quite common in many areas of Saskatchewan, or is it specific to prairie dogs?
Yeah, so it really is more so prairie dogs that are really strongly herbivorous, and they occur in these large colonies. And we're still learning about how important they are as keystone species. So even beyond birds, there are many species that associate with the really short structure and soil changes that occur on prairie dog colonies. And they actually they interact with fire. So there's work showing that prairie dog colonies actually reduce the frequency of fire. And so it's kind of this third kind of disturbance that interacts uniquely with kind of larger scale ungulate grazing and fire, in addition to them being this important food source. So, ground squirrels are still an important part of the food chain, but they aren't really ecosystem engineers in that same way.
Okay, thank you for that answer.
Mm.
We've had lots of questions about neonics. Um,
Mm.
can a person feed cracked corn to chickens or wild birds, or is that not good?
I certainly wouldn't feed the same if it's the corn that you're planting, unless you know that you really bought one that is not treated. Yeah, I definitely would not recommend just throwing that out there.
Okay. And is it banned anywhere in North America? Like neonics, are they banned anywhere in North America?
No, so Canada has done more than the United States to legislate certain kinds of applications and schedules. And there are some states in the United States that are starting to look at this, but we really haven't seen any bans the way we have in the European Union. And this is still an area there's lobbying going on both sides. Industry, of course, is resisting this, and it's still an area of active research. I think we're still kind of understanding how these affect birds, and quite frankly, how they may affect other things in the environment.
And how do you think we can get them banned?
Yeah, I think trying to donate and support groups that are advocating for this. American Bird Conservancy has been really involved in trying to do political advocacy to lobby for that. I think, if you see things on the ballots, if you see things coming up, calling your representatives, making noise about it. Yeah, that's probably above my pay grade, but
Yeah. Well, thanks for that answer. Um,
yeah.
and we've had some questions about haying, and I just want to mention
Mm.
that we have somebody on the line from Birds Canada. Kyle Drake is there, and he's kind of written in a few comments too. But yeah, he's kind of said that delaying until at least July 15th is the best for people. And I guess Birds Canada also has a really great resource, a nesting calendar query tool that the link has been shared in the comments there. And he's also given an email address that people can contact to get some more specific information about, going slower, cutting higher, using flush bars, cutting in an inside out rather than an outside in pattern. So there's quite a few resources available for anyone there that's interested.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you for sharing those resources. And yeah, those are great tips. And yeah, absolutely agree. If you make it to late July, I think that's the best thing you can do. And there are also some programs out there. Different nonprofits have looked at things where they're able to offer compensation for producers that delay and things of that nature. So yes, thank you for sharing those additional tips and resources.
that's all the time that we have today, but I just wanted to sincerely thank you for this comprehensive overview about grasslands birds and for sharing the information with us today. So thank you, Jacy.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation to be here, and I appreciate everyone that turned out. So yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. Awesome. And to everyone who caught our webinar today, I've been recording it, so we'll get it up on our YouTube channel in the near future. And when you leave, there'll be a quick 1 minute survey. So as always, if you don't mind filling that out, it helps us keep our Native Prairie Speaker Series going into the future. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.